and welcome to this interaction with Dr. David Brewster, who is a Senior Maritime Fellow here at Gateway House. I am Samir Patil, Associate Fellow in National Security. David has recently completed a paper on India-Australia security engagement, and he will be talking a little more about it today. So, David, would you like to start with what you have covered in your paper?
Yes, so I'm here in Mumbai to launch the report on India-Australia security cooperation. And that discusses, it focuses on the issue of maritime security in the Indian Ocean region and discusses what Australia and India have done together to date, and then goes through a number of potential areas where Australia and India could work more closely together.
Okay. Looking back in history, there was a lot of stern reaction coming in from Australia to India's nuclear tests in 1998. How do you sort of look at that issue?
Well, that issue in some ways reflects some big ideological or cultural differences that were between India and Australia at that time. In particular, Australia has been one of the most foremost supporters of nuclear non-proliferation regimes throughout the world, which essentially meant that only the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council were allowed to have nuclear weapons. That was a regime that India did not accept, and in 1998 it tested its own nuclear weapons as a statement to the world. Australia did act quite strongly at that time, as did a number of other states such as Japan and the United States, seeing it as an unhelpful development in security throughout the region. And but frankly, all of those countries, and including Australia, soon after started backing away from that position when they realised that there was no way that India was going to give up its nuclear weapons. It's an issue which I think a number of Indians remembered for how strongly the Australian position was worded, but I think that's now largely been overcome.
You talked about the change in the Australian perception towards India and the change in policy. One of the manifestations of that was the lifting of the restrictions on the uranium export to India. How do you look at that?
Well, again, I think you have to put that in context of how strongly Australians feel about uranium and the uses of uranium. It's a little odd because Australia has the largest reserves of uranium in the world and is becoming one of the largest uranium exporters in the world. But then on the other hand, Australia obviously doesn't have nuclear weapons, and neither does it have any nuclear power. And so it's while being a uranium exporter, it's very concerned about the uses of uranium.
Looking at the bilateral maritime engagement, most recently the navies of India and Australia participated in Exercise Milan in Andaman and Nicobar Islands. How do you think both the countries should take forward that naval engagement?
Well, I think the naval engagement will be one of the key areas of engagement between India and Australia in the security dimension. And I expect that most countries in the region would see it in positive terms, a partnership between India and Australia to help manage and provide security within the region. I expect that it would be seen quite positively.
And you have also talked in the paper about India and Australia doing some bilateral cooperation in developing the amphibious capabilities. Can you expand on that point?
Well, that's an interesting area because it's an area where both the Australian and Indian navies have placed a lot of emphasis in recent times. And so they are building their capabilities through acquiring amphibious ships and the like. Those amphibious ships, their primary use in reality is going to be to provide humanitarian and disaster relief in the region So, for example, if there's an earthquake or a cyclone that devastates a state in Southeast Asia, for example, these are the ships on which aid and assistance is going to be delivered. And so I think that there's a lot of potential there for India and Australia to cooperate in putting in structures so that if an event like that happens, they can work together to provide that assistance.
Now, coastal security has proved to be a worrying factor for the Indian security point of view, and we have the example of the 2008 Mumbai attacks. What is the experience of Australia in this on this front, and what insights can it offer to India?
Coastal security is a very big issue in Australia. It's not really directed at maritime terrorist attacks as it is in India, but nevertheless, it's a big issue, and it led to Australia developing a very successful system of being able to track the movements of vessels throughout much of the Indian Ocean region by putting together information from a whole variety of sources. So that allows the Australian authorities to know, where vessels are in the ocean and where they're headed. And I think that there's probably a lot of lessons that the Indian authorities can learn from that experience.
Now, going beyond the maritime engagement, which are the other areas in the bilateral relationship that India and Australia can cooperate?
I think that there's quite a lot of other areas. I think the two armies have many shared traditions stemming from the British links, as do the air forces. Increasingly, the Indian Air Force is acquiring a lot of US equipment, which means that in a few years' time, India and Australia will share many of the same Air Force platforms. And I think that opens up a lot of potential for cooperation, whether it be in terms of maintenance or training or doctrine and the like, that weren't there before. There are also other areas that can follow on, such as sharing of defence technology potentially, and for example, cooperation in the Antarctic, which really isn't a security issue, but it's an area that relates to the Indian Ocean and can be an area of good cooperation, I think.
And what's the feeling within Australia on this kind of cooperation from the private sector particularly?
Well, I think that there would be a lot of enthusiasm to work with Indian companies if some of these bureaucratic obstacles could be overcome. And in particular, there are a lot of Australian companies working in the naval shipbuilding area, and I know that increasingly there is a lot of Indian private companies working in that area. I know that there are a lot of opportunities for cooperation, for example, in training and the like, working together.
You talked about the potential cooperation in the Antarctic. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, that's an area that I have a particular interest in. And the Australians have had stations in the Antarctic for some 60 years, I believe. Indians have been in there a little bit shorter period, but just recently India opened a new major station over near where all the Australian stations are.
Okay.
And that has opened up the potential for greater cooperation, including in logistics, which in the Antarctic is an extremely important area, so that Australia could help ease some of the logistical challenges that India faces. But also in areas of scientific research, there are a lot of complementarities in terms of the research that Australia and India are carrying out in the Antarctic. And I'm sure that there are many areas that they could work together in.
Now, moving beyond the bilateral and looking at the regional security scenario, recently there's been much talk about reviving the Quadrilateral Security Alliance, which was there between India, Australia, US, and Japan. You have talked about the fact that the Quadrilateral was kind of a missed opportunity for both the countries. What are the challenges presently in terms of reviving that alliance?
Well, I think that there are a lot of opportunities to do something of that nature, particularly with the new Japanese government under Mr. Abe. He's returned, and that the original quadrilateral idea was an idea of his. And so I think the Japanese have a renewed interest in something of that nature, which I think they're calling the diamonds or something like that. The Australians, I think, have a lot of interest in moving the India relationship past bilateral to include at least trilateral relationships with countries like Indonesia or Japan or the United States. So I think that there is probably enthusiasm there certainly both from Australia and India, and if there are concrete proposals made in that regard, I think it will probably be looked at quite favourably.
And there's a perception in India which looks at takes a very adverse view of China. What has been Australia's perception of what China has been doing in the Asian continent? Well,
Australia naturally has a different perspective on China because Australia has a different relationship in China in economic terms, but also geographically, where China's not a neighbouring country and we don't have some of the historical issues that exist between India and China. But certainly over the last 5 years or so, there has been growing concerns about the assertiveness of China in the South China Sea and East China Sea, and would like to see China acting in a responsible manner as a major power in both East Asia and the Indian Ocean. And I think that there's an awful lot that Australia and India can do to work together to figure out mechanisms to bring China into a relationship in the Indian Ocean region where it could play a positive role.
Good. So thank you, David, for those wonderful and, may I add, really interesting insights on the India-Australia security engagement. David's entire paper is available on the Gateway House website. That's www.gatewayhouse.in. You can follow us also on Twitter with hashtag of GH Security and also on our Facebook page. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.